I promptly quit my job, which, by the way, is highly not recommended. But, I was young and I was strong-headed, and somebody had given me the speech about how you need to burn your boat.
Welcome to Business Buying for Financial Independence. I'm Tim Delaney, and I help young professionals buy small businesses so they can escape the 9-to-5 and take control of their time, income, and future. If that sounds like you, hit the subscribe button and let's get into it. Today, my guest is Tiffany Ko. Tiffany is a business strategist and consultant who helps business owners build smarter, more scalable companies through better systems, finding the right people for the right seats, and financial clarity. Before that, she built and sold an outsourced accounting firm from the ground up after finishing her career as a corporate accountant and auditor. Tiffany, welcome to Business Buying for Fi.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks so much for having me on today. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so am I. Tiffany and I met at a real estate conference, the Bigger Pockets conference, back in October. And we connected over talking small business and buying and selling small businesses. And I was excited to hear that Tiffany had actually sold a business. And I thought she'd be a great fit for this podcast to share with some of you that are listening to how to buy a business, what a seller goes through from their end. And since then, Tiffany also is consulting businesses on buying and selling and other aspects of running their businesses. So I am sure she'll be a wealth of information for us all.
Well,
Tiffany, do you want to just start with kind of a little background on yourself, high level,
yeah.
where you came from, what you do, what you did?
Yeah. Yeah. So my background when I started in anything even business related was in accounting. So I was a traditional accountant. I graduated college with an accounting degree, went straight into the Big Fours and became an auditor and quickly burnt out in about 2 to 3 years time, like every other auditor in a Big Four. So and then I kept downsizing my size of company. So it took me a little bit to figure out I didn't want to be a financial auditor, but then my company size kept down, like getting smaller. I kept going to smaller businesses. And then eventually became a corporate accountant of a company that's like 60 people. And then that was when I was like, all right, you know what? Enough is enough. I think I got to try this on my own. And then so I promptly quit my job, which, by the way, is highly not recommended. But, I was young and I was strong-headed, and somebody had given me the speech about how you need to burn your boats. So I was like, okay, so I'm going to burn my boats. And I quit my job, my lovely, cushy, six-figure job in DC, and then went off and decided to hang my shingles and learned right off the bat that selling is not easy, even if it is selling yourself, and went through a good 6 to 8 months of zero revenue because I couldn't sell anything. I didn't know how to sell even accounting. And from that started kind of my business journey of figuring out how to tinker with a business properly to eventually to get it to sell, because I knew probably about 3 or 4 years in, I was like, I am definitely going to set up this business to sell if it kills me. But I feel like that's a good challenge to have a good goal. And so that's what I did. And luckily I was able to do that. Kind of went through the whole journey, which, I'm sure we'll dive into more. And then now on the other end of it, I spend a lot of time kind of helping companies position themselves to sell with the founders and things like that. So it's been quite a ride.
That's awesome. And quite the story, especially the risk of literally burning your boats and getting out of a cushy job to no revenue. You talk to a lot of people that are like, okay, I got a couple clients, now I'll go out on my own. No, you just went for it. That's awesome. That's a great mindset to have.
Only if there's a
little
success on
risky.
the other side of the story.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, what was the worst that was going to happen? What would you had to go back
Yeah.
and get another job?
Yeah, I had to go back and get another accounting job, right?
I'm guessing
Yeah.
you didn't, walk out of the office giving everybody the finger and saying I'll never be back.
No, not at all. Not at all. My lovely my direct report, who was the CFO, was kind of really nice to me, and he's like, "Can we at least like work out like a 90-day consulting contract so we can kind of help with this transition?" So I did. So there was no fingers given on the way out.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So when Tiffany talks about burning the boats, it's not the same as burning your bridges. Don't
No.
don't ever leave your job and tell them things that you've been
Yes.
wanting to tell them for years. It's leave on good
That's right.
terms. Because that is the worst case scenario. If you go out and try something on your own, is that you go back and live the same life that you were living. Like, right? That's kind of.
It is.
So this was an outsourced accounting company that you were building.
Yes.
Can you explain to people what that is?
Yes, probably better than I did when I was trying to sell it my first year of doing it. So my specialty was kind of back office accounting. So bookkeeping, accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, financial reporting, kind of all the way up to what we call like a controller in for small businesses. So we were fractional, so people can buy a portion of what they need. And my whole idea at the start was to kind of scale up with our customers, right? Of course, I did this without having never really used QuickBooks, which is the main accounting software of any small business. So there we go. But that was it. We kind of stopped short of doing any kind of tax or any kind of CFO level type of services either. We were very much focused on just the day-to-day accounting and what I would like the term keeps the lights on. So your bills paid, collections coming in, things like that.
And if you have run a small business or you're thinking about running a small business, that is a critical piece of running a business. And if you do not know how to do it yourself or you're not good at doing it yourself, then a company like Tiffany's is highly recommended. I deal with companies all the time that have no good bookkeeping system, and it's a struggle to figure out if they're profitable, how profitable, what they can afford to do, what they should be investing in. I mean, you've probably got a ton of stories like that of companies that were just lost because of bad books.
Yeah, you'll be surprised too. I mean, when I first started the business, I focused on smaller businesses, meaning like those under probably like $1 million. And we quickly pivoted and ended up with businesses between a 1 and 10 because that's where things kind of got exciting. A lot of the more sophisticated reporting is needed and process is needed at that level. But you'll be surprised, even at that size of a business, how kind of in shambles the books are and the financial reports are, which is why today I always talk about only working with business owners who kind of have that M&A mindset, because at that point, at that juncture, you realize how important your financial reports are and how that's kind of your first impression when you go out and try to sell your business, because that's all the buyer sees at first. So that doesn't tell the right story, then you're kind of starting off on the wrong foot.
Yeah. And that's even as an owner, it doesn't matter how well you think you know your numbers in your head or what's going on or what your bank statements show. Having that story, as Tiffany put it, to present to somebody else, to a buyer or to an accountant or anybody for taxes, it needs to be clean and easy to understand for somebody else. When you were, so you said you struggled selling that service for the first few months. What finally made it click and have customers start coming in?
So I ended up saying yes to a bunch of things I had no idea how to do, to get my foot through the door. I absolutely did. I sweated bullets for like the first 3 months of one of my clients who actually stayed with me all throughout the tenure of the business. So I'm very fortunate that they actually took a chance on me because I was obviously green to everything. But they took a chance on me. I said yes to doing processing payroll, which I have never done in my life up till that point. So, talk about high stakes, right? If anybody's going to get mad about something, it'll be like their payroll being wrong. And so I did a lot of that, kind of put my head down and figured out how to do it. And then eventually from that, learning how to piece together service packages and things like that to then be better with my talk track. The problem was I didn't even know as simple as the fact that when you go out and you tell people you're a CPA, which I was, people think you do taxes. Like they have no concept of what a bookkeeper is, right? And so it's a lot of small misses like that where I just had to get out there, do it over and over and over again until I felt like my pitch landed. And then things started making sense. And you cobble together the right packets, the right pricing. And then, of course, the next level is hiring people because if you wanted to make it sellable, you can't be dependent on you as the owner. If you want any value, enterprise value in what you have. And from there, just, again, it was very much an organic learning curve.
Nice. I heard you mention on another podcast that you hired a full-time person pretty early on in this journey as well. Can you talk about that mindset a little bit? Because for a lot of self-employed people that go out, and especially in the service industry, like what you were providing,
there's a tendency to want to keep every dollar of revenue for yourself. It's
Yeah.
coming in and you can do it all, and you want it. So what was your mindset in that hire?
So when I made the first hire, it was really because I knew my end goal was to sell the business. And after reading some books and kind of, well, YouTube was a little early on then, but there were still some things online about it. I just knew that I needed a system that worked on its own that wasn't dependent on me doing all of it. And so, again, I think I went to the absolute, and I immediately went to hire. I had a couple 1099s to start, but then it only lasted about 6 months before I just went full time W-2 because I wanted that control over the work product, right? The consistency of delivering it and having processes and having people being able to follow that process day in, day out. So that was kind of what pulled me there. Now, was I very well prepared? No, again, I was not very well prepared, Tim.
Yeah.
Apparently, the thing of my story
Yeah.
is, just do it and then figure it out afterwards. So it was a little bit of a jarring journey because I, for some reason, in my mind, certainly coming from like the corporate world, just kind of had this feeling that everybody was the same. Everybody had the same work ethics. Everybody would grind as hard as I did. And then realized that no, other people have other priorities in their life. And also the responsibility of the fact that you're in charge of their livelihood now, right? You are their entire income. So that responsibility and that realization hit me pretty hard, pretty fast. And, again, just kind of made me pull up my big girl pants and really figure out what it is to actually hire and manage people, and then how to train them so they have a consistent work product that is about 80 to 90% of how you would do it yourself.
Okay. Just for those listening, the difference between a 1099 and a W-2 is that a 1099 is an external contractor. They're not actually an employee. You give them work to do,
Hmm.
they do it, you pay them, but you can't really dictate their hours or there's a lot of rules and regulations around it, but with a W-2 employee, that's like your typical job that most people get is you get hired, you get a
Hmm.
weekly paycheck, might get vacation time and all the other
Yep.
the perks. So,
Benefits.
um, but as a business owner, having that W-2 employee on your books is a lot more risk because now you have unemployment insurance, you have just more HR
HR
issues to
needs.
deal with. Yes.
Very true.
Yeah. And so you made that decision because you had already decided that you were building this business to sell. What,
Mhm.
you mentioned some books, but what was did you have that epiphany and then go find the books, or did you read something, and how did that come about?
I read something. I'm not sure if it was exactly this book. I think it was Built to Sell. I think I again read the title of it and I'm like, that's amazing. That's so smart. Now, the book itself really has a little bit about building your business to sell, but not really. It's really talking about how to build your product and your services to sell better. But for some reason, reading that one line kind of just dawned on me that I was like, well, you know what? If I'm going to build a good business and I built it to sell, even if I don't sell it, this should be a pretty viable business for me if this is my end goal. And so that kind of, again, I feel like as business owners, sometimes you get pretty obsessed with an idea and you just run fully towards it. So that's what I ended up doing. I was like, well, this is it for me. That's how I want to do it. And then the rest of it kind of just came along with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting mindset, especially because one of the most common questions I get asked all the time, or statements is from people, is why would a business owner ever sell their business? If it's profitable or if it's good, why would they sell? And here you are saying you built your business to sell, like almost from the early stages of the business. And now, from a buyer's perspective, sometimes those aren't
Hmm.
necessarily the best businesses to go after to buy because they're not, they might come with a little bit more of a premium price. But on the other side, they're set up properly. So you know that it's going to have a higher chance of success after you buy it. Um, so just for all of those out there that constantly ask, there are business owners that want to sell their businesses and plan to do it right from the beginning.
Hmm.
Um, I guess, so what were some of the things that you did besides hiring those employees? What were some of the other things that you initiated from an early stage?
So, selling packages is something that I initiated from a pretty early stage. Again, what I was trying to get at was reoccurring revenue. Being able to have something that is pretty consistent. So we were charging by the month. And because a lot of people in our industry typically charge by the hour, your revenue tends to fluctuate. So I kind of figured out, okay, how do I create things into a simple package, which one makes it easier to sell to a customer? You're not giving them a million options for some variable rate. You're giving them 3 simple options to go with it. It's a set price. Now, of course, there was a couple of times I ate it in the front end because I didn't quite get my pricing right. But eventually I got it right. And so setting up packages and then being able to um, simplify and decide kind of what our niche is in the business, right? So again, our industry suffers from trying to do it all. Yes, I can do that. Yes, I can do payroll. Yes, I can do tax. Yes, just a lot of yeses to everything. And to, again, have reoccurring revenue that's consistent, which again builds your enterprise value, you kind of need to narrow down the number of what you can say yes to, because not only is it easier for customers to understand what you do, it's also easier for our employees to know what they are doing. So they don't have to learn. For example, like a good example would be other companies tend to say, I will support your books in any software and system you have. Now, every software and system is different. So I was thinking about it and I was like, well, that means all my employees would have to be trained up in whatever system comes our way. That could be quite hard to kind of control and have a good work product at the end of the day. So we end up saying we only support customers on QuickBooks and that's it, flat. So if you have something else, sorry, you got to go somewhere else. We're not for you, right? And so that a lot of it was really simplifying the business. And it was a little easier too because, I had a pretty good idea of who my buyer might look like. So I figured, either we're going to be a company that another accounting firm wants to bolt on because they don't do the, outsource accounting piece. Maybe they only do taxes, or maybe they do this piece a little bit and they just want to expand. So I always figured that I was going to end up selling to somebody who's already somewhat in the same industry we are. And I was thinking, well, what would be appealing to them for them to buy?
Awesome. The piece about knowing who you were going to sell to,
Mm-hmm.
if anybody's ever done any marketing work or talked to a marketing agency, one of the things that they always talk about is building your customer avatar of
Mm.
who is your ideal customer, who is your buyer, who is your, who are you selling to? And you did that on a whole other level of kind of thinking about who was going to buy your whole business, not just your
Yes.
services. I mean, it sounds like you had that avatar for your actual customers, but you were also building that in your mind for your
For my
end
buyer.
buyer. That's
Yeah.
a good thing to do. Just exit planning in general is something that a lot of small business owners overlook.
Mm-hmm.
They either just think that they're going to run the business forever and ever and it doesn't matter, or they just don't want to think about it. But there's lots of different ways to plan for an exit. Selling is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Transitioning to management is another. But it's important, if you're somebody listening to this podcast because you're in the process of going out and buying a business or you want to buy a business, having that exit plan written down from day one of that acquisition is important as well. Um,
Yeah, definitely. It also simplifies everything because you know what your end goal is. So it's not that many decisions you kind of have to make. You just want to make decisions that get you to that one outcome. So it just makes decisions just a little easier. But it's interesting because it kind of works in all directions too. I imagine that a buyer probably should also have an acquisition profile of the type of business they want to buy, right? So this again makes it a little bit easier for the options that you'll be presented of what fits kind of your box or what the profile you had in your mind.
yeah, that makes sense. Especially on the end goal piece, having a vision, knowing where you're going, it sounds constraining, but it also, it's to your point, it simplifies things because every decision goes through that check box of, well, does this support the end vision or not? And if not,
Mhm.
then don't do it. Like you talked about with QuickBooks, like focus on that one platform and say no to the people that don't want to use QuickBooks. That makes sense. Um, how, in this process, how long did you go from starting the business to selling it?
It was about, let's end of year 7 going into year 8,
Okay.
I wanna say. Well, actually, no. So I started in 2012. I sold in 2020. Oh, yeah. So it's about year 8. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And at what point, so you knew that you wanted to build the business to sell
Mhm.
from an early stage. Did you set a timeline from an early stage of like when you thought you might be ready to sell?
Not a timeline per se, but there was a milestone. Like, I kind of knew certain things in the business I wanted to work a certain way before I felt like I would be ready to go to market. Now, at this point, I also didn't know that much about what going to market really meant.
Hmm.
So, again, a more prepared human being probably would have done some homework in that sense. But I knew there were certain things like, where I want our recurring revenue to be at so that it made more sense than kind of the one-off consulting stuff we were doing, or the ad hoc revenue, kind of know what our net profit wanted to be at, gross profit wanted to be at. So there were certain attributes to the business I was kind of looking for. And so when it came up to year 7, and I was honestly at the point where I think I had another year, like another full year before I felt like, okay, this business is something I can go out and shop on the market and see who will be interested.
Nice. And when you made that decision to go start shopping it, what what was your kind of like checklist of things that you did prior to that? And then how did you go about doing it?
So I actually ended up selling earlier than my original idea of where I was, only because what I did was I was testing the concept. Anybody wanted to buy this? So I started talking to people and letting certain select people I know in certain groups that, hey, I'm looking to eventually exit this business by sell. And this is what we're doing now. And just to kind of see reactions to see who would be interested. Lo and behold, like 6 months later, somebody I was talking to was like, well, wait, we're ready to buy something. Like that's exactly in our plan next year. And that's how we started the conversation. So I didn't really have too much of a linear path to, starting to shop. It just kind of came on me a little sooner than I thought, which really put a lot of my theories to test, especially through due diligence and everything.
Yeah. And I guess I'd like to kind of dive into what that actual process was. What, from, okay, you have a potential buyer. What
hmm
what did you do? Did you, what was the next steps from their side and from your side?
Yes. So he had designated somebody in the business, it happened to be their CFO, to kind of make acquisitions for the year, identify and kind of make the acquisition. So he had reached out to me. We had a good conversation, kind of talked a little high level about what the business did, how we did it, how many people we have, kind of where we are, again, in a very general high level. Once it was decided that, yeah, this is something that we'd be interested in, and they wanted to issue a letter of intent, then that's where we talked a little bit closer about real numbers, right? What's my revenue number at? What our profit is at? And from that, they issued a letter of intent. Um, and then the letter intent, it's something to be negotiated. So that's one thing I learned, which I feel like I was a little bit late in the process. The letter intent is basically like a summary. It's like the cover of the book, right? Like you kind of have a pretty good idea of what the deal is, but you don't get into the nitty gritty until after there's a contract and after due diligence. But it's supposed to be the high level like outline of what your offer is. And so when they gave me that first letter of intent, kind of panicked because this is all happening way sooner than I thought it was going to happen. And by the way, this is also when we started hearing little chirps about this weird flu that was running around too. So you're hearing about this in the news. And so at the same time, I'm like, oh, I don't even have a lawyer ready, right? Because I just didn't think this was going to happen when it happened. And so I had pre-planned a CPA, a tax accountant that I wanted to help me through that was familiar with M&As, but then I didn't have a lawyer. So I actually reached out to a friend, and he kind of immediately helped jump in, and completely revised the first letter of intent, because depending on your buyer, some buyers come out really strong out of the gate, some don't. I mean, this kind of depends. The offer we had was very much in favor of the buyer, which is okay. That's kind of what you're supposed to do. You start negotiations. And so we ended up revising it a few times before we got to the final, let's sign the LOI and start due diligence.
Okay. What was there anything in that original LOI that jumps out at you as being very buyer friendly? Or was it just the price or
Well, it wasn't so much the price. The price valuation was pretty industry standard. In our industry, it's anywhere from 0.75 to about 1.5. So I think they ended up coming in about a multiple of 1. So that was pretty good. The issue was kind of how that was going to be paid out. And so it was originally just paid out in mostly equity, which, that was not my goal. My goal was to exit the accounting side of business altogether at some point. So I was like, I am not going to stay around in another business. And so eventually we had ended up changing it. So it was a mix of a cash payout and then earn out over time.
Okay. So a couple terms that Tiffany mentioned there, the multiple, that's a multiple on the EBITDA or seller discretionary earnings, which
Hmm.
is essentially how much money Tiffany was making at the end of the day after all of her expenses. And then you multiply that, depending on the industry, by a number, anywhere from, in Tiffany's industry, 0.75 to 1.25.
Hmm.
Um, which sounds, if you're first time you're hearing something like this, it sounds pretty low. So you're a business owner, and we'll just use arbitrary numbers. You're making $10,000 a year, and you're saying that you're only going to sell the business for $7,500. Um, so from a new person in this realm, why would you
Hmm.
ever do that? Why would you take less than you're even going to make in 1 year?
Well, so it's interesting. So there's other concessions to that, right? So the reason why I wanted to wait another year before my business was ready to sell is because, of course, the more the owner is detached from the business, meaning it's not relying on you to actually run, the more leverage you have in negotiations, right? And so, this buyer caught me pretty early on. So I was kind of left with the decision, I could possibly really reach my exit sooner than I would like, but I definitely was a bigger leverage on the business because we haven't gotten all the pieces in play yet, right? So it was a kind of a decision of time, versus, a bigger payout later on in the year. And so it's all circumstantial. It's all in negotiation. You never know where a buyer or even a seller's mind is at. They have all different goals. And because I knew I was going to exit eventually, the one thing I didn't realize was how would I feel as responsible as I was for my current existing employees, right? Because my goal was to exit. I didn't want to exit and say, well, F you guys, you go figure it out, right? And you guys are out of a job in the next month or so, or maybe the next like week. And so that was really important to me to negotiate a good transition for our employees. So other parts to this package was they agreed to take on all my employees at the current rate and put them in similar positions and keep them employed, right? And then also with our customers, they were, pretty flexible on making sure we're transitioning them well, because again, our customers were small business owners, and they relied on us. And I didn't want my personal decision to affect the outcome of their business. And so all that also kind of added in to make sure that this was a good deal for the time that it was.
Yeah. So a
Yeah.
lot of emotion going into that decision as well, not just
Yeah, more so than I prepared for.
yeah, not just straightforward numbers. And that's the case with most small business transactions. Is I've talked to some other people that stress the importance of that personal relationship between the buyer and the seller. Being able to build a good rapport and hashing things out at a kitchen table of the buyer.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of emotion in the transaction. Anyway, you did have a lot of emotions with your employees, with the
Mhm.
the transition. Oh, they earn out. So
Yes.
another, that's typically if you're an average buyer and not already an existing company looking to grow by acquiring others, you're not typically offering equity to the seller. But in this
Mhm.
case, it sounds like it was a larger company acquiring Tiffany's company to add on to their
Yes,
portfolio, their book
that's
of
correct.
business, which for some people, they're like, okay, I'll take equity in that larger company because that company is going to continue to grow.
Right.
So if you are a seller that believes that new company is going to grow, but Tiffany didn't want to be an employee again, so she just
Mhm.
wanted to get out, which is fair as well. Um, Earnouts are something that the owner will get based on certain performance of the ongoing business, so that the
Mhm.
buyer doesn't feel like they're uh, getting cheated if all
Mhm.
the customers turn around and leave because they were all based on Tiffany's personal relationships,
Yeah.
or the employees all get up and leave because Tiffany, they had loyalty to Tiffany and not to the new boss.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, anything else about the emotional aspects of the whole process?
I thought I was prepared in a sense of, you hear people talk about all the time, fairly cavalier, like, oh, I'll be ready to sell. I'll be ready to sell. And they feel like selling and a disconnection from their business is going to be so easy. And I had mentally prepared myself because I knew there was an emotional component after doing research. I understood that. And I didn't want that to sway or bias the transaction itself. But even with that preparation, I was completely emotionally wound up into it. Right? Like it just is. It's hard. Like I only spent about 8 years in my business. Other people spent even more years in their business. So if you think about that, it's just emotionally you do get wound up, you do get pulled in. And it was hard to see clear throughout the transaction because you were so emotionally invested. And I didn't think it was going to be as heavy as it was, but it did. It really was. And I'm sure there was a period of time after the transaction signed where I was still kind of rolling around on the emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's, only 7, 8 years, still a
Hmm.
significant chunk of time, but
Yeah.
relative to some sellers that have been in their businesses for decades and, you know, it's been their whole life and their whole identity has been around that is it can be quite the process for them. So just always as a buyer, just always remember to take that into consideration from early on and throughout the process that you might get an email one day that says deals off, I'm not selling, give it a minute, give it some time and be careful about making comments or stepping on their toes or you know saying things that might be interpreted differently because there is a lot of emotion, and when there's a lot of emotion, small things can really blow up a deal pretty quickly.
Yeah, until it's signed, it's not a deal yet.
Yep.
And so it can go down to the 11th hour. I actually worked with a client like that where it was New Year's Day, not where I thought I was going to be on New Year's Day, kind of playing a little bit of the middleman between the buyer and the seller. And I was the buyer was my client. And I swear to you, up till until we signed it, which he thought we were going to go in there and be out in about 2 hours, right? Because this has been a deal that we've been working on for some time. Yeah, we were there from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m., where I swear his lawyer almost blew up the deal. And I was like, what? It's 5 p.m. Like, let's get this going. So until they sign, anything could have gone any which way. And, again, kind of like what you were saying, there's a lot of emotions involved. So I caution clients like that now, we always have this ideal, which is, oh, I'm going to buy a business and I'm going to keep the owner on as an employee for about a year or two to help them transition. I'll kind of handcuff them to a earnout and they're going to be willing participants. Usually none of them are willing participants because as business owners, as entrepreneurs, we have our own ideas. We have strong opinions about how we think things should run, which is probably why we end up going out on our own anyways. And so most of those relationships always blow up after the fact because the old owner can't stomach what they're seeing being done to their business. And the new owner is like, well, it's mine now. Why are you even fussing about this? And so, yeah, that's
Yeah,
a real risk.
great point. I just talked to somebody else who bought a business that he worked at for 25 years and had a falling out with the owner within months of buying
Mm.
because the seller just, was still didn't like what the new direction was, even though he sold it. So,
Yep.
I mean,
A little
luckily that was
possessive.
after the deal, but it's, so just be careful during that process. Be aware that there are emotions going on for the seller. Uh, During the due diligence process, anything that caught you off
Mhm.
guard or surprised you or things you would do differently during your due diligence?
I should ask my buyer that only because due diligence went, kind of somewhat smoothly, right? Because again, coming from an outsourced accounting firm, I was also a little bit more organized than most, and I knew the financial stuff they were asking for and looking for. So it was pretty easy to kind of put that all together and then send it over to them. Now, because we're doing it directly, there was no broker or anything, there was no data room or anything like that. It was just a simple, some kind of cloud drive that we did this with. So it actually went okay. I mean, a lot of it is, and we had joked about it, due diligence is trying to uncover the skeletons, right? Like, what is it that about this business that, may not be all that it seems on paper? But because I was so prepared to sell it, I was very upfront, and everything I said pretty much matched the data that we provided, because there's really nothing to hide if you were genuine in trying to sell. And so I wonder from their point of view, they're like, wow, okay, we were kind of expecting maybe a little bit more of a disaster, because even now in my consulting life, what we usually deal with, either something is on no cards and only no cards, or it's on some weird Excel sheet that doesn't make any sense, or it's, just non-existent, and it's not done, like the financials aren't even put together based on GAAP or anything that would actually help represent what the business is actually doing. Like, there's just so many of those things, and it's like pulling teeth trying to pull it all together. So,
Yeah. I almost wonder if I was the buyer of your business, I would almost I wonder if like red flags go up because you had everything so buttoned up. Some, but I guess from a company that does that for a living or for their business, I would expect it to be pretty buttoned up. And you went
you'd
into
hope
it
so.
planning to sell, so that also um, lends itself to having everything in order.
So one thing that did surprise me, though, now that we're talking about it, was so of course they need to see your client list, right? Because I mean, the biggest asset is your clients. What I was not prepared for is them actually calling my top 5 clients, because again, I gone through the work of distributing my client revenue. So you don't have like the 2 clients that make up like 50% of your revenue, which again deleverages your business. So I had probably a good about evenly sized top 10 clients that made up probably about 50 or 60% of revenue. So they were like, we need to call 5 of them. And I'm like, oh, well, nobody knows I'm selling. So this is going to be an interesting conversation. So yeah, that was a surprise to me.
So at least they did ask before they just went and did it.
They did. But I
Okay.
mean, I think the idea of, like, you think about it and you're like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if
Yep.
I was buying, I would want to validate the revenue coming in, right?
Yeah.
And is the company set up the way they said? So I did know those 5 clients. So I did give them a little bit heads up. And the buyer did a beautiful job of talking to them. It wasn't awkward at all. But, they were basically trying to suss out, is the revenue real? Will the clients stay? Or are they so attached to Tiffany and her company that if the sale goes through, they'll immediately drop the contracts and run away? And so, yeah, that was a little bit of a test I was hoping that I would pass.
Yeah, and that is, as a buyer of a business like that, a service-based business, it is a huge question of, are those customers
Mhm.
just there because the owner's there, or are they going to stick around because they value the business that they hired? So I don't blame them for calling, and I guess it's just a good reminder of, even from that early stage of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, that you have language in there that prevents them from a buyer from just going around you and not even telling you that they're doing that, because
Yeah,
that could
that would have been
catch
awkward.
your customers off guard, cause problems for you, especially if the deal doesn't go through and now you potentially lost customers. So,
Mhm.
um, you talked that deal that you did on the New Year's Day. You were an advisor to, or you were working with the buyer.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things I've had a real estate deal where it was an off market deal, but we luckily had somebody in between, like it was kind of acting like a broker,
Mm.
because it helped the conversation, especially when we needed to ask for a lot of concessions after final inspection, or not final, but after, we made an offer based on seeing a little bit of the property. And once we got a good look at the entire property, we had to change our offer quite a bit. And
Mm.
having that middle person helped that a lot. Um, can you so you did a transaction, you sold your business without a middle person, and then you've also helped people buy and sell businesses. Do you want to talk about the value that a middle person brings to a transaction?
Yeah, so I mean, this was kind of accidentally. I kind of fell in this role, right? So, I kind of went into it with more of a financial responsibility, and then quickly kind of ended up in this kind of middleman position, and noticed that, because I myself I'm not part of the transactions, in the sense that, like, I don't see the deal, I don't broker the deal, I don't even architect the deal so much, but having that neutral third party um, just makes things a little bit easier, because sometimes there's like things that the buyer's not willing to say to the seller, and the seller is not willing to say to a buyer. But on a one-on-one with a neutral third party, they will kind of let on some things that is actually very vital to making sure that the deal works. And I found myself going into that position being the person that says, hey, I'm here to make sure both sides are happy, right? And sure, you want some things and you want some things, and you both need to understand you want different things. How do we find a nice middle ground so you both walk away from the deal, with everything that you've asked for? And yeah, I feel like that did, I mean, not to pat myself on the back, but I feel like I think that's also what brokers do probably pretty amazingly well, is that just alleviated the pressure from both sides because, if you put a buyer and a seller at a table, sometimes, again, emotions spill through and things like that. Somebody like myself is a little bit step removed, a little detached from the actual transition itself, just kind of helps the conversation.
Yeah, you're looking at everything a little bit more objectively. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and you're not a broker, so you're not even paid on the closing of the
No.
sale necessarily, which is where
Yeah.
some people will point to brokers in real estate and business and say they don't really care. They just want to get the deal done because that's how they get paid.
Mm.
Um, but that's not always the case. For the good ones, they care about the quality of the deal and that everybody comes away happy, uh, and it can be valuable. You talked about that lawyer as well, which reminds me, I've heard people talk about attorneys in deals, that there are attorneys that are deal makers and there are attorneys that are deal breakers, and know which one you have going into it because and what kind the other party has, because they can blow up deals. They have their clients' best interests at heart, and sometimes a little bit overly so. So let's talk a little bit about your transition from, so you sold the business and now you are doing this consulting and helping other businesses. Talk a little bit about what your company is and what it does.
Yeah, so I come in as basically like a fractional operator in a sense, right? So I come in and I kind of assess the business. So typically my clients are in a position of either acquiring or they're trying to sell, right? And I always say that, regardless if you're going to sell or not, running a good business is going to have all the same elements and ingredients to it. So typically now my clients are ready to buy, or they just bought a business and they're doing like a post acquisition kind of integration instead. And so you come in and you assess, is the business even able to take on an acquisition? Because adding in a big volume, especially if you're acquiring a business, not just the client list and doing what they call like kind of an asset sale, a lot of times you are taking on and maybe absorbing the employees, which means you're trying to integrate a different culture. So if the main business itself is not ready to take on more volume, you'll simply just break the machine that you already have. And so it's an assessment of that. Where are you financially? Where are you? Where's your people at? Where's your process at? Where's your system at? And then being a fractional, whatever it is, whether it's a operator, whether it's a sales and marketing, whatever it is, to kind of stand up that side of the business so it's ready to take on more volume. And then if you're doing like a post acquisition integration, I mean, I kind of want to get there before they do the acquisition. Because it's usually cleanup afterwards where there are questions that the buyer has forgotten to ask that actually doesn't make an impact and muddies the thing after the fact. But if it's a post-acquisition integration, it's again thinking through what are the systems, thinking through how do you integrate the client list, what's the messaging, kind of what all of it is to make the deal work well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a strategy I feel like more and more companies are utilizing. Maybe it's just because of this podcast or talking to other people in acquisition space, but growth through acquisition is a great way for a business to grow. You hear about it and see about it in the headlines with big publicly traded companies, but it happens in small businesses all the time as well. And so, uh, but it's a big step. Can you talk about like a typical client size, or like what kind of volume they're doing and what they're adding on?
So the specialty that I still work in is between a 1 and 10 million. So the main company itself is usually between that size. So let's just say it's like an average about 3 to 4 million. So typically they'll go out and they'll look for something that is around the 900 to a million mark. Which is also debatable because when you think about the amount of legal effort, consulting efforts, broker, whatever, all those costs that goes into an acquisition, buying a $900 to $1 million business is almost the same cost as buying about a 1.5 to like $2 million business, right? But you have different challenges with those sizes. So funny enough, our clients typically look at the 9 to $1 million sizes to be able to acquire those businesses. And usually it's to add volume. So it's probably something they're already doing. And they simply know that adding that volume is way faster than trying to grow it organically. But it's also tricky to find the right business. You want one that's about the same values that you have about, you don't want to buy a business with like, employees who spend there for 30 years and they're cranky. Although that's also a good story because I definitely was part of a announcement of a purchase in which one person stood up immediately at the announcement was like, I quit, and then walked out the door. And I'm like, okay, well, I didn't see that one coming, but okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of those kind of very exciting stories
Yeah.
to be enjoyed.
Yeah. That's just like we talked about with the buyer and seller on an individual level, having a good relationship and being aligned and getting to know each other. That when one company is buying another company, there are a lot of factors going on in the background. That culture is the biggest one. If you have a great culture and then you acquire a company with the same amount of employees that have a terrible culture, it's going to be a tough go integrating together.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
In those types of acquisitions, is there anything different than just a individual leaving their corporate job that's going out and buying a business? Anything that stands out that would be a little bit different for them?
Yeah. I think the main piece is that if you're already a company that's been running, ideally, and part of what I do is making sure you have the infrastructure, right, to absorb these business, which means you probably already have somebody in the business that functions as your main operator. If you're quitting your corporate job to go buy a business, oftentimes I think, just human mindset of not having owned a business before, you underestimate the importance of having a good operator because if there is no operator, guess who gets to be the operator? And that is not a fun position to be in when you just realize you spent all this money to buy yourself a job you never really wanted. so, so I think that's probably one of the biggest element. You don't have culture issues because you're not trying to combine two companies together into one, but you do have like a steep on-ramp of understanding the people who are already there and whether or not somebody already has leadership there, or are you coming in and being that leader, and whether or not you're the leader they want to follow, because the last thing you want is to buy a business and then all of your technicians who are actually doing the work up and quit. You don't have much of a business after that. So I think with the businesses that are buying other businesses, they tend to also have more resources. So they get to spend more time with consultants. So they spend more time doing due diligence. I feel like solo operators spend a little bit less time doing due diligence, and they don't always ask the right questions or all of the questions, just out of sheer not knowing and not having maybe great consult or advice to do that. So they walk in and there's so many unknown elements that they discover after the fact, which could have been prevented if you had just asked the right questions to begin with and had structured that into your deal.
Yeah. Speaking of questions to ask, what are some of the best questions that you think a buyer should be asking?
Well, trust but verify. So ask the question and ask for the proof as well, right? So as anybody who's selling their business, it always is the most perfect, magical, the thing system that you've set up, which is, usually about 80% of the truth. And so, I mean, aside from the normal, what's your revenue, who's your client, yada, 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 there's little nitty gritty stuff that people tend to forget, especially when it comes to the employees. Like, what did the owner promise the employee? Especially if you're buying mom and pop shops, there's a lot of informal agreements that are made between the owner and an employee, which, by the way, just because it's not on paper doesn't mean you're not saddled with that afterwards. I've definitely seen it where a key employee, one of the biggest moneymaker, revenue generator employee, had this off the book deal with the former owner. The poor new owner came in and didn't realize this, didn't ask about it, like point blank, came in and got saddled with this awkward position of this employee wanting a certain bonus structure because it's been promised by the previous owner. And now you're the new owner. So guess who's the sucker, right? In the thing.
Yeah.
And, again, wasn't clearly identified, wasn't marked in the deal. So it just became a bit of a mess to clean up.
Yeah, that's a good one. Making sure that you ask what arrangements have been made with employees or what promises have been made, because you never know. I mean, some owners make make a lot of agreements off the books that are never documented properly, and because that's the way a lot of small businesses are run. And so making sure you're asking those kinds of tough questions. I always suggest to, if you are able, and some sellers don't like this, but if you can go and hang around the business and meet people and just, be there as much as you can. Sometimes that's the best due diligence, but not all sellers will allow that. So,
And you can't always tell your employees. Like my poor employees learned about the fact that I had sold the business literally one day after the stay-at-home orders went in play for COVID. And so I was planning to tell them in person because we were on-prem type of business. And then I couldn't because we just got this crazy order where nobody could go to their office. So I literally had to tell them virtually, which was not ideal. But you can't tell them because until the 11th hour, you don't even know if your deal's going to go through. So if you're lucky enough to be able to hang around the business, that would be ideal. But, a lot of times it's probably not going to happen.
yeah. Why is it that most sellers do not like their employees to know that they're selling?
That's a good question. So I think because employees would have fear for their jobs, right? It's distracting to them. And that's the hardest part about selling a business is because you're doing all this stuff in the back end with the transaction, assuming that you don't have a full team with you or anything like that. But at the same time, you have to keep the actual business running day in and day out. So whatever your capacity is with that, you kind of have to play both hats. And so, I mean, I would imagine that as an employee, if I heard, oh my gosh, this company is selling, I'll be asking, well, what's my job going to look like and what's going to change, and all this uncertainty that will really disrupt the actual business itself. And people have to understand, if you're a smart buyer, which my buyer was smart, you'll have a period of adjustment after you buy the business, right? So if anything tanks, they're typically going to tie some kind of your price to that. And so you kind of want to make sure, if you're in a service-based business, your employees are on the top of their game, still providing the services so that you don't have anything going wrong during this adjustment period.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And it's usually not because the seller is trying to hide something. It's just because they want their business to be sustainable and don't want, employees are very nervous about change, and
As they should be,
yep,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to explain it.
Yeah. Anything else that you would like people to know about buying or selling a business?
Maybe I'm a little bit kind of crazy, but I think it's the most exciting thing to do. And it's the quickest way to growth. And I think it's far less intimidating than most people think. You just have to be very detailed oriented and rely on your instinct and ask good questions. I think when I first went through my transaction, I was, emotionally overwhelmed, but then also a little bit intimidated because obviously the other company's been around for more time. They're bigger. They have probably better paid lawyers than I had, all these things where I felt pretty intimidated that I probably didn't ask all the questions as I would like in hindsight. But today we also have this marvelous ability to go online. We also can learn so much from YouTube or from podcasts like this where people are freely sharing their advice. And you also have AI to go ask, so you can at least prepare yourself with the foundational knowledge. So I think it's probably more accessible than ever for people to go out and buy businesses. And I think that silver tsunami, I think they call it, where the 60-some, 70-some-year-olds are kind of retiring from their mom and pop shops or their generational service-based businesses. That's a real thing. We're seeing it everywhere. People wanting to exit and not knowing how to exit. And a lot of them literally are thinking about just one day closing their doors. And you're like, these are great opportunities. There's a lot of risk, of course, with the reward. But these days, I think, again, people just have so much, they can be so much better prepared. And it's definitely a real option now to kind of get you to being a business owner and possibly generating cash flow much faster than it would be if you were trying to organically grow a business from scratch.
Yep. I completely agree with that. And I even just saw a statistic the other day that There's estimated about 2 million businesses in the US that are planning to just close their doors in the next 5 years. Not even talking about selling or anything else, just closing up. So there's opportunity out there, and it's way faster than starting from scratch. So
Yes.
get out there and start looking. Where can people find out more about you or utilize your services if they're the right fit?
Yeah. So the company's name is August 88 Solutions, which is also just our website too. And again, I don't know if my information could be shared. I'm more than happy to share it. Certainly, you can contact me directly with any questions or whatnot. I will say that I do consulting now, but I only do it for one or two companies. It's probably going to be less or so next year because, it's time for me to go out and buy a business as well. So I'm going to be in the game. But I always love to, like you, kind of share good information, help other people prosper as well. So always open to questions or emails or even, quick phone calls if needed.
Awesome. Really appreciate that. We will throw your contact details in the show notes below. If you're listening or watching, you can find me on Threads and Instagram at Tim T. Delaney. And please let us know what you thought of the show. Reach out, leave us a message, leave a comment. And thank you very much, Tiffany, for being here. Really appreciate your time and your insights. It's been super helpful. Hopefully everybody out there got some great information.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks. Have a good day, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Business Buying for Financial Independence. If you're serious about owning your time and building long-term wealth, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.